Hello everyone, this video is about the Brandenburg-Class pre-dreadnoughts of the Imperial German Navy. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The late 19th century was a time of great naval rivalry. The Brandenburg-class battleships were a key part of this ambition. These four, named Brandenburg, Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm, Wenzenberg, and Worft, represented a major step forward for the German Navy. They were larger, more powerfully armed, and more capable than any previous German warships. The Brandenburgs were pre-dreadnought battleships, the final evolution of this type before the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought. But let's provide some background. In March 1883, Leo von Caprivi became the Chief der Admiralität, which means Chief of the Admiralty. Following Albert von Stolz's resignation, Caprivi was required to submit a monumentum to the Reichstag on his plans by March 1884. A general of the Imperial German Army, he was inexperienced in naval matters, and he convened a council with senior naval officers on the 16th of January 1884 to gather opinions on future naval construction programs. At the time, he was constrained by the fleet plan of 1873 that had been under Stark's direction and had been approved by the Reichstag. The plan governed the size and composition of the German fleet, calling for 14 ocean-going ironclad warships, a total that was reached within the launching of the casemate ship Odenburg in 1884. The nominal completion of the 1873 plan further restrained Caprivi, as in the view of many members of the Reichstag, naval budgets could be reduced, since no new ships would be needed until the oldest ironclads began to reach 30 years of age in the mid-1890s. At the January Council meeting, Caprivi emphasized the need for careful consideration of new designs, noting that the Navy could not afford the luxury of failed experiments due to parliamentary refusal to authorize funding for new ships. Concerns with a two-front war against France and Russia dominated Caprivi's thinking, which resulted in his decision to opt for a strategy of coastal defense in his monumentum. He noted that without a powerful battle fleet, the sea-going ironclads would have little utility against numerically superior French fleet. He also pointed out that at the time, shell designers and armor manufacturers were competing to defeat each other, which necessitated spiraling costs for navies that attempted to keep pace with the latest technological advancements. He also saw that the torpedo could be used to easily sink large armored warships and would be an effective weapon for coastal defense. As a result of these considerations, Caprivi recommended building a large number of smaller coastal defense ships and torpedo boats to defend Germany's coastal line in the event of war. Aware of the parliamentary objections to increased naval spending, he avoided plans for the construction of expensive battleships. Consequently, the French Navy, then at the height of the dominance of the Junicle, came to the same conclusions with respect to their competition with the British Royal Navy. Indeed, the 1870s and 1880s marked a period of technical and strategic confusion in naval thinking in the world's major navies for some reasons that Caprivi had highlighted in his monumentum. Despite the monumentum submitted to the Reichstag that ensued capital ship construction, Caprivi secretly discussed new ironclads at length with senior naval officers. He instructed Counter-Admiral Max von der Goldix, when the director of the Admiralty's Naval Department, to prepare a list of 13 questions concerning the characteristics of a new capital ship, and then to circulate them among naval officers to gather views on the topic. The questions included requirements for speed, cruising radius, maximum draft, whether sailing rigs should be included, the number, type, and arrangement of main battery guns, and the armor type and layout. It's met with several other officers, including Hans von Koster, August von Thotzmann, Hohenstock, Wilhelm Buschel, Karl Brandon, Karand von Brandenhetzen, Grodot Submitzt, and Kurt von Mostschilden. Try saying those names 5 times fast. What a mouthful, huh? On the 20th of October, 1885, to discuss the V questions. They settled on a ship armed with four 30.5 centimeter guns, arranged in the lozenge pattern favored by contemporary French capital ship designers, a thick armored belt and armored deck, and an ability to steam for 5,000 nautical miles. Other questions, including the speed and crew size, were left unanswered. A lithograph of the Siegfried-class coastal defense ship, SMS Heindel at the time, Caprivi requested design proposals from the Naval Construction Office, which submitted plans for ships that ranged in size from small 2,500-ton coastal defense ships armed with a battery of two 21-centimeter guns to heavily armed 10,000 tons ocean-going battleships equipped with seven 30.5-centimeter guns. The Reichstag still refused to authorize expensive new ships, especially in light of the costs of creating the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal. Although Caprivi was able to convince enough members that the entrances of the canal would be vulnerable to attack and that coastal defense ships would be necessary to guard them, the Reichstag accordingly approved funds for 10 such ships, which ultimately became the 6 Siegfried and 2 Odin-class coastal defense ships. The last two vessels were later cancelled in 1893. The first ship, SMS Siegfried, was authorized for the 1887 and 1888 budget year. In early 1887, Kapitan zur See, Captain at Sea, Frederick von Hauptmann, who was now Caprivi's chief of staff, presented plans for the 1889 to 1890 budget year that included the construction of one of the seagoing battleships requested by Godzi's committee, which a second vessel scheduled for 1892 and 1893 year. Caprivi replied that funding would have to be approved by the Reichstag, and that there was still testing necessary to determine what type of armor they should carry. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died, and his successor, the terminally ill Kaiser Frederick III, remained on the throne for just 99 days before passing away as well. The new Kaiser Wilhelm II was an ardent supporter of the Navy, which was to have a profound impact on the future of the service. Shortly thereafter, Caprivi resigned and was replaced by Vice Admiral Alex von Moltke in March 1889. Wilhelm II reorganized the naval command structure, creating the Richtermarine, which was now in control of naval construction. The Navy initially requested a pair of battleships in line with Hauptmann's projected budget, with Wilhelm II intervened to demand 4 new ships for the 1889 and 1890 budget. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck secured funding for the ships through the larger Army expansion bill, though the Reichstag delayed funding for the latter 3 members of the class. Alright, back to the design. Chapter 2. The unique design of the Brandenburgs. The design for what was to become the Brandonburg-Class was prepared by Chief Constructor Alfred Derichs. He originally used Oldberg as a starting point. His first monumentum on the project, he noted that Oldberg's design would have to be enlarged to provide room for the more powerful propulsion machinery and increased coal storage, and armor would have to be strengthened among other changes. Displacement was originally fixed at 8,500 tons. In a subsequent monumentum dated August 8, 1888, Derichs raised the possibility of increasing the caliber of the main battery from 24 centimeters to 26 centimeters. Derichs met with Mons on the 15th of August, who requested that the new ship be armed with 4 28-centimeter guns, since the 26-centimeter guns were perceived to be too small to effectively engage the latest Russian ships being built. This version was submitted 2 days later to Wilhelm II, who approved it. Derichs initially considered the latest German battleships being built, the Erika II and the Imperator Elixir the second classes, which arranged their main battery to emphasize end on fire. He briefly examined the possibility of mounting 2-gun turrets forward, similar to the Icona II design, with a beam necessary to accommodate guns of that size, along with the hull armor, would have made the ship too large to be docked in most German dry docks. Variants with 4 to 6-gun turrets were also prepared, as was a version with 2 twin turrets and 2 with single-gun wing turrets. At this time, the displacement limit had been increased to 10,000 tons, though the RMA agreed to allow an increase to 11,400 tons, as that was the maximum displacement that could be accommodated by existing infrastructure. As Dyrich continued to work on the plans, he examined other foreign contemporaries, including the French Admiral Battleships-class ironclad battleships that carried 3 main battery guns in individual barbette mounts on the center line. He proposed an armament of 6 heavy guns in 3 2-gun turrets in the same arrangement. While this would reduce the end-on-fire capability, the RMA determined that the heavier broadside outweighed the reduction in firing arcs ahead or stern. The ships were to have carried a uniform battery of 6 28cm MRKL-35 guns, but during construction, a longer 40 caliber version, the MRKL-40 variant, became available. The fore and aft turrets received the longer guns, but the center turret did not have enough space to fit them owing to the closeness of the aft superstructure, so the shorter guns were retained. The Brandenburgs were the first ocean-going capital ships to be built for the German fleet in almost 20 years. Their construction caused significant concern in Russia, which was a possible naval opponent in the Baltic Sea. The Russians decided to strengthen their Baltic fleet with as many as 10 new battleships, though funding proved to be insufficient, and the program was significantly pared down. The Brandonburg-Class was significantly smaller and less powerful than the contemporary British Royal Sovereign class, but roughly equal to the series of French battleships begun with Charles Miguel and with the Russian Marin. Though they were the first modern battleships built in Germany, preceding the Tirpitz-era high-class seas fleet, the authorization for the ships came as part of a construction program that reflected the strategic and technical confusion of the 1880s, caused by theories like the Joel Exco. General characteristics. The ships of the Brandenburg class were 108 meters long between particulars, 113.9 meters long at the waterline, and 115.7 meters long overall. They had a beam of 19.5 meters, which was increased to 19.74 meters with the addition of torpedo nets, and had a draft of 7.6 meters forward and 7.9 meters aft. The Brandenburgs displaced 10,013 tons at their design weight, and up to 10,670 tons at full load. As was the standard for German warships of the period, the Brandenburg-class ships' hulls were constructed from transverse and longhexagonal steel frames, over which the steel side plates were riveted. The vessels had 13 watertight compartments and a double bottom that ran for 48% of the ship's length. Their hulls featured a tumbler home shape above the main deck, as was common for warships of the era, a ram bow. The ships had a raised forecastle deck that extended to the aft funnel, thereafter reducing the main deck level. The German Navy regarded the ships as excellent seaboats, and the Brandenburgs had easy motion. They were also responsive to commands from the bridge and had moderate turning circle. Despite their generally positive handling characteristics, the ships were wet at high speeds, despite the forecastle deck, and suffered from severe pitching. The ships lost up to 30% of their speed at hard rudder. Their metacentric height was 1.5 meters, and their maximum stability movement was 31.5 degrees. The ship's crew numbered 38 officers and 530 enlisted men. Though while serving as the squadron flagship, the standard crew was augmented by an additional 9 officers and 54 men. After their refits, their standard crew consisted of 30 officers and 561 enlisted sailors, with an additional 9 officers and 48 enlisted men on flagships. They carried a number of smaller boats, including a pair of picket boats, 2 launches, 1 pinnace, 2 cutters, 2 yawls, and 2 dinghies. Machinery. The ship's propulsion consisted of 2 3-cylinder triple expansion engines, with steam provided by 12 coal-fired transverse Scotch Marine boilers. The engines had their own engine rooms and drove 3-bladed screw propellers that were 5 meters in diameter. The boilers were also split into 2 boiler rooms, and they were ducted into a pair of funnels. Electrical power was provided by 3 generators. The equipment varied from ship to ship. Power output ranged from 72.6 to 96.5 kilowatts at 67 volts. The ships each had 1 rudder. The engines were rated at 10,000 metric horsepower for a top speed of 16.5 knots. Though in service, the ships varied both in power and speed. Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm, the vessel with the lowest power, 9,686 horsepower, nevertheless reached 16.9 knots, the same speed as Warft, the vessel with the highest power output at 10,228 horsepower. Brandonburg was the slowest member of the class, falling short of the design speed at 16.3 knots. Coal storage amounted to 650 tons under peacetime conditions, but additional hull spaces could be used to increase capacity to 1,050 tons in wartime. The ships had a cruising radius of 4,500 nautical miles at a cruising speed of 10 knots. Traveling that distance is like driving from London to Narco 5 times, or sailing from Southampton to Nigeria, or stacking 448,000 double-decker buses from end to end, or sailing from New Zealand to Chile. It really shows of how big the world really is. Armament, main battery. The Brandonburg-Class battleships carried a battery of 6 28-centimeter guns of 2 different calibers. The forward and aft turrets mounted 40-caliber guns, while the amidships turret required the use of shorter 35-caliber guns to allow the turret to rotate. The turrets consisted of a rotating platform that held the guns, protected by an armored barbette on all sides. An armored hood with curved sides above the barbette protecting the guns and crew, but the curved shape of the front of the hood necessitated large openings through which to raise and depress the guns, which proved to be a liability since enemy shells could enter through them, as happened to Barbados Hydron in 1913. The 35-centimeter guns had a muzzle velocity of 685 meters per second, or 2,250 feet per second, while the longer guns had a velocity of 715 meters per second, or 2,350 feet per second. The differing velocities produced different ballistics, but the designers were not concerned with the problem, owing to the short ranges at which the ships were expected to fight and the primitive state of fire control in the 1880s. Propellant charges consisted of brown powder. Both types of guns used the same C92 barbette mount that allowed for depression to -4 degrees and elevation to 25 degrees. The 35 caliber guns had a maximum range of 11,450 meters, or 37,000 feet, while the higher velocity of the longer guns increased their range to 15,090 meters. The turrets are hydraulically operated and require the rotating gun houses to return to the center line to reload the guns. Quite an inconvenience, wouldn't you say? In their original configuration, the guns had a rate of fire of 1 shot every 3 minutes, but after the refits in the early 1900s, the ship's reloading equipment was modernized to improve the rate of fire to 1 shot per minute. Ammunition magazines stored a total of 356 shells. Those were 240 kilograms or 530-pound projectiles and had a 56.6 kilogram or 125-pound bursting charge. Secondary and tertiary guns. The Brandonburg class's secondary armament initially consisted of six 10.5 centimeter SKL-35 quick-firing guns in individual casemates arranged in the armored battery below the forward superstructure. These guns had recently been adopted by Krupp from existing guns to employ quick-firing technology. Guns were in MPL C91 pivot mounts that allowed elevation to 30.3 degrees for a maximum range of 10,800 meters or 35,400 feet. Their rate of fire was theoretically 10 shots per minute, but in practice it was limited to 7.5 shots per minute. The muzzle velocity was 600 meters per second, or 2,000 feet per second. Though with the CO7 shells, introduced in 1907, this increased to 620 meters per second, or 200 feet per second. Well, it's a slight improvement. It's better than nothing. During their modernization, another pair of guns was added, and ammunition storage increased from 600 rounds to 1,184 shells, a mixture of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. For close-range defense against torpedo boats, the ships also carried 8.8 centimeter SKL-30 quick-firing guns. These were also mounted in casemates, 4 in sponsons abreast the forward main battery turret, and 4 in the rear superstructure. They were carried in MPL C89 mounts with an elevation of negative 10 degrees to 20 degrees. At maximum elevation, the guns could reach targets at 7,300 meters, or 24,000 feet. The muzzle velocity was 590 meters per second. These guns were supplied with a total of 2,000 shells. Although, as with 10.5 centimeter guns, ammunition storage was increased during the modernization to 2,384 rounds. These were all originally C/83 common shells, though they were replaced by CO1 semi-armor piercing SAP shells in 1901 and CO7 shells in 1907, which came in HE and SAP varieties. The rate of fire was theoretically 14 shots per minute, but in practice it was limited to 10 rounds per minute. Torpedo tubes. In the 1880s, naval tacticians assumed most battles would dissolve into a close-range melee, where torpedoes would become the decisive weapon, since they could damage a heavily armed ship below the waterline where the armor belt could not protect it. While these ships were under construction, Armament agreed in a February 1891 monumentum that the original torpedo armament was not sufficient. He suggested that 2 torpedo tubes should be installed in the bow below the waterline to increase the forward firepower in the expected melee. There was no room in the bow to fit 2 torpedo tubes, however, so they were fitted in above-water mounts. At the same time, many foreign navies were adopting larger torpedoes, including the Royal Navy, which had shifted from its standard 35.6 centimeter torpedo to a 45 centimeter version. The Germans followed suit. The older 35 centimeter C-84 torpedo was replaced with a much more powerful 45 centimeter C-91 version. The ships received 6 45 centimeter torpedo tubes, 4 of which were mounted on the sides of the ship in above-water swivel mounts. The other 2 were in the bow, also above the waterline. The tubes were supplied with a total of 16 torpedoes, which carried an 87.5 kilogram warhead. They had a top speed of 32 knots, which is 37 miles per hour, compared to the 24 knot speed of the C-84 torpedoes. This allowed the torpedoes to travel 400 meters in 24 seconds, instead of the 30 seconds it would have taken the older torpedoes, making aiming at moving targets significantly easier. Maximum range at 32 knots was 500 meters. When set to 26 knots, their range increased to 800 meters. Armor. The first 2 ships, Brandonburg and Worf, received compound armor, then the standard type of steel armor manufactured by Dillinger-Hattie, but at the time, Krupp was experimenting with a new nickel steel-plated armor that was ordered for Wittenberg and Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm. The compound armor was constructed by welding hardened steel together with more flexible wrought iron plates to take advantage of the hardness of the steel and the greater flexibility of the wrought iron to break up and then contain the incoming shells. Krupp's nickel steel armor was based on the Harvey process, which enriched the upper layers of the steel with carbon. The process hardened the outer layer while retaining greater flexibility at the back of the plate. The fact that the new armor plate consisted of a single forging instead of multiple plates welded together gave it greater strength. This allowed the use of thinner, and thus lighter, armor belts that provided the same level of protection, which in turn permitted more comprehensive protection for the same weight of armor. Some portions of Brandenburg did not receive new Krupp armor, including the barbettes that held the fore and center main battery turrets. All 4 ships retained teak backing to their armor belts. The teak was used to help absorb the shock of a torpedo or naval mine detonation. The side protection system followed the so-called French principle, using a narrow, full-length armor belt to protect the hull, rather than a shorter citadel system that only protected the ship's ammunition magazines and propulsion machinery spaces. The belt extended from 0.8 meters above the waterline to 1.6 meters below, though toward the bow it was extended further down to reinforce the ram. Above the waterline, the armored belt was 300 millimeters forward, and as the belt moved further aft, it stepped up to 330 millimeters, and then 380 millimeters, then finally to 400 millimeters in the central portion of the ship, where it protected the magazines and machinery spaces. Further aft, it tapered to 350 millimeters, and then to 300 millimeters toward the stern. Below the waterline, the armor belt was significantly thinner. Like the upper belt, it tapered towards the ends. It started at 150 millimeters at the bow, increasing to 180, and then 190, and then 200 millimeters thick amidships, and tapered down to 180 on the aft end of the belt. The teak backing for the belt amounted to 200 millimeters, and the assembly was bolted together. The Brandenburgs had an armored deck of 600 millimeters thick that was connected to the upper edge of the belt. It was effective only at deflecting short-range shells. It could not have resisted plunging fire or a shell that had detonated on impact. Forward conning tower was 300 millimeter sides and had a 30 millimeter thick roof. The barbettes for the main battery turrets were 300 millimeters thick and backed with 210 millimeters of teak. Gun houses for the main battery had 50 millimeters roofs and sides that consisted of 3 40 millimeters layers, for a total of 120 millimeters. 10.5 centimeter and 88 centimeter guns received gun shields that consisted of 2 plates of steel bolted together. Each shield consisted of 20 millimeter plate and a 22 millimeter plate. Modifications. Over the course of their careers, the ships underwent a series of modifications. After entering service in 1894 or 1895, the vessels had their funnels increased in height by 1.5 to 3 meters to reduce smoke interference with the mainmast spotting top. Beginning in 1896, the German Navy began to acquire 3.7 centimeter Maxim guns to supplement the 88 centimeter guns in anti-torpedo boat defense. These were very light weapons, firing a 0.66 kilogram projectile. The Germans believed that a hail of fire would prevent torpedo boat crews from approaching close enough to launch their torpedoes. Guns had a rate of fire of 100 rounds per minute, but using deliberate fire, the rate was 33 shots per minute. 4 of these guns were installed on top of the fighting tops of the ship's masts. For their deployment to East Asia in 1900, all 4 ships received wireless telegraphy sets, making them the first ships of the German fleet to carry radio sets. Between 1902 and 1904, the 4 ships were extensively modified. During the modernization, a second armored conning tower was added to the aft superstructure, along with a gangway. The new tower had size 120 millimeters thick and a 220 millimeter thick roof. The work included increasing the ship's coal storage capacity and adding another pair of 10.5 centimeter guns. Plans had initially called for the center 28cm turret to be replaced with an armored battery of medium caliber guns, but this proved to be prohibitively expensive. The ship's torpedo armament was significantly reduced. 2 of the broadside tubes were removed, as were both bow tubes, while one above-water tube was installed in the stern in a trainable mounting. Total torpedo storage amounted to 5 torpedoes. Their masts had their searchlight platforms removed. The refit reduced the ship's displacement by 500 to 700 tons. Later in her career, Worth received 2 searchlights mounted on the roof of the fighting top of her foremast, along with a third on the roof of her aft bridge. An enclosed spotting top was installed in 1915. Both she and Brandenburg were de-armed in 1916 after they were removed from active service. Chapter 3. The ships of the Brandonburg-Class. SMS Brandenburg was the lead ship of the Brandonburg-Class of pre-dreadnought battleships. She was the first pre-dreadnought built for the German Navy. Earlier, the Navy had only built coastal defense ships and armored frigates. The ship was laid down at the A.G. Vulcan shipyard in 1890, launched on the 21st of September 1891, and commissioned into the German Navy on the 19th of November 1893. Brandenburg and her 3 sisters were unique for their time, in that they carried 6 heavy guns instead of the 4 that were standard in other navies. Named after the province of Brandenburg. SMS Worft, which means His Majesty's Ship Worf, was the second ship of the Brandonburg-Class. Worf was laid down at the Germanovith shipyard in Kiel in May 1890. The ship was launched on the 6th of August 1892 and commissioned into the fleet on the 21st of October 1893. She was named after the Battle of Worth, fought during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. SMS Rosenberg was the 3rd pre-dreadnought of the Brandonburg-Class. Rosenberg was laid down in 1890 in the A.G. Vulcan shipyard in Stanton, launched in 1891 and completed in 1894. SMS Kodrik Frederick Wilhelm, His Majesty's Ship Prince Elector Frederick Wilhelm. The ship was named for Prince Egder Frederick Wilhelm, 17th century Duke of Prussia and Margrave of Brandenburg. She was the 4th pre-dreadnought of the Brandonburg-Class. She was laid down in 1890 in the Imperial Dockyard in Wilhelmshaven, launched in 1891 and completed in 1893. As the members of the class entered service in late 1893, they conducted sea trials that lasted until 1894. First, Frederick Wilhelm's test revealed problems with her propulsion machinery that required lengthy repairs for much of 1894. Brandenburg suffered a boiler explosion during sea trials on February 16, 1894, that killed 44 men, 25 crew members, 18 shipyard workers, and 1 from the commission evaluating the trials. The accident had been caused by an incorrectly manufactured valve in the starboard engine. The 4 ships were among the last German vessels to undergo builder's trials before formal acceptance by the Kaiserliche Marine. After Worf, most German capital ships underwent testing after commissioning. Chapter 4. Early Voyages and the Far East. As the members of the class entered service beginning in 1894, they were assigned to the 1st Division of the 1st Squadron, and Co-First Frederick Wilhelm became the squadron flagship. Throughout the rest of 1890s, the ships conducted routine training exercises, visits to foreign countries, and training cruises. Maneuvers included tactical training, shooting practice, and joint operations with Imperial German Army units to practice coastal defense. The ships were involved in a number of accidents. Brandenburg collided with the Aviso Jutland in August 1896, and in November 1899, Worf struck a submerged rock and was badly damaged. As the largest warships of the German fleet, they frequently escorted Wilhelm's yacht Heisersallen on state visits or to sailing regatas, most notably Cosette's Week in Britain. During the Boxer Uprising in 1800, Chinese nationals laid siege to the foreign embassies in Beijing and murdered Baron Curtis von Kessler. the German minister. Widespread violence against Westerners in China led to an alliance between Germany and the 7 other great powers: the United Kingdom, Italy, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the United States, France, and Japan. The Allied forces in the country were insufficient to defeat the Boxers, so the Kaiser ordered an expeditionary force, which consisted of the 4 Brandenburgs, 6 cruisers, 10 freighters, 3 torpedo boats, 6 regiments of Marines, under the command of Field Marshal Alfred von Very, to deploy to China. At the time the German fleet had arrived in August 1800, the siege of Beijing had already been lifted by forces from the other members of the 8-nation alliance that had formed to deal with the Boxers. As a result, the task force suppressed local uprisings and around Judo Bay, where Germany maintained the Judo Bay leased territory. In the end, the operation cost the German government more than 100 million marks. On May 26, 1901, the German High Command recalled the expeditionary force to Germany, arriving in mid-August. After returning from China, the ships resumed their typical peacetime routine. By this time, the Kaiser Frederick II and vessel classes of battleships had begun to enter service, so the Brandenburgs were decommissioned to be modernized. By late 1907, all 4 members of the class were reduced to the reserve squadron, with Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm again serving as the flagship. Ships operated together there for the following 3 years, before Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm and Rosenberg were sold to the Ottoman Empire in September 1910. Brandenburg and Worf remained in the reserve squadron through 1911, being periodically reactivated to participate in annual fleet maneuvers in the 3rd Squadron. Briefly served with the Training and Experimental Ships Unit in mid-1911. At the end of the war, they were decommissioned once again, their place in the unit being taken by other battleships as the latest dreadnought battleships entered service. They were allotted to the Marine Station Der Atze, Baltic Sea Naval Station, and laid up in Kiel. They were modernized in August 1914 following the outbreak of World War I. They were assigned to the 5th Battle Squadron, which was tasked with coastal defense in the North Sea to guard against the attacks by the British Royal Navy. 5th Squadron was moved to the Baltic in September to support an amphibious assault against Russian forces in Waldau, but the shortage of transports led to the cancellation of the operation. Crew shortages forced the Navy to decommission the 5th Squadron ships in Kiel in early 1915. But after German forces seized the port of Ladau, Brandenburg and Worth were reactivated and moved there to guard the harbor. Brandenburg was then converted into a water desalination and barrack ship, and her guns were removed. Worth remained in commission as the flagship of Kaiser Alfred Vergitz, the commander of the 5th Squadron, but she saw no action in Landau. The squadron was disbanded in January 1916, and Worf steamed to Danzig, where she was decommissioned and converted into a barrack ship. She too was disarmed, and her guns were built into Kurfürst railroad guns. Brandenburg's guns were intended to be sent to the Ottoman Empire as spares for Kurgitz, but there was no evidence that they were actually sent. She was to be converted into a target ship, but the war ended before work could be completed. Owing to the severe shortage of merchant shipping after the war, plans were proposed to rebuild Worth into a freighter, but the plans came to nothing. Both ships were struck from the Naval Register on May 13, 1919, and sold to shipbreakers, both vessels being dismantled in Danzig. Barbados Hensik and Torquat Gudetz, on entering service into the Ottoman Navy. Kurfürst Friedrich Wilhelm and Rosenberg became Bados, Hadrian, and Targot Ritz, respectively. So those were the ships that Rosenberg and Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm later became. After entering service with the Ottoman fleet, the ships suffered from chronic machinery problems, as their crews were not trained to properly maintain their propulsion systems, which reduced their speed to 8 to 10 knots. At the outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War in September 1911, the Ottoman fleet withdrew into the safety of the Brandship to avoid confrontation with the much stronger Italian Riga Marina. Having been neglected by their crews during the conflict, they were in even worse condition by the end of the war in October 1912, with their telephone systems out of service and many other watertight doors unable to close. Their rangefinders and ammunition hoists for the main battery guns had been removed. With the Italo-Turkish War all but over by early October, the Balkan League declared war on the Ottomans, having been encouraged by Italy's easy victory. Both ships were pressed into action, initially to support Ottoman forces defending against the advance of the Balkan troops in Thrace. In December, the fleet was reorganized to challenge the Greek Royal Hattrick Navy in the Aegean Sea. Barbados Hadrian was the flagship of the armored division. The division sorted to attack the Greek fleet in December, leading to the Battle of Eel, where the Greek armored cruiser Georgos Atrof used her superior speed to outmaneuver the Ottoman squadron, placing it in a crossfire between Agraf on the side and the 3 Hydra-class ironclads on the other. The Ottomans retreated back to the Janzits in disorder. The second attempt to break the Greek blockade of the Janzits occurred in January 18th, 1913, resulting in the Battle of Liamos. Hayreton and Targat Rates were both hit several times but suffered relatively minor damage before withdrawing once again to their dungeons. The Ottoman fleet spent the rest of the war operating in the Sea of Mota and the Black Sea against Bulgarian forces, helping to protect the Kaskya garrison through March. August 1914, when World War I broke out in Europe, the Ottomans initially remained neutral, but they entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in November. Barbados Hadrian and Targat Rates were partially disarmed in late 1914 and early 1915 to improve the defenses in the Darwitz, though they retained their main batteries, so they could be used as floating batteries to support Danzig's fortresses during the Danzig's campaign. Oh, so the word is actually the Dardanelles. I've been saying the word the whole time wrong, so please excuse it. By March 1915, the Ottoman command had decided to keep only one vessel on station at the time, so vessels could be withdrawn for maintenance and resupply. In April, the British and French fleets launched the Calliope campaign. The British submarine HMS E-11 torpedoed and sank Barbados Rayton on August 8th. She was moved into position to bombard Allied forces fighting at Gallipoli. Sinking caused the Ottomans to withdraw Targat Rates, and she remained out of service until January 8, 1918, when she was reactivated to tow the battlecruiser Yukit Sultan et Sasalam. I'm sorry that I butchered that name, which had run aground after the Battle of Irmos. Targat Rates was again decommissioned in October and remained out of service until she underwent a refit in 1924 and 1925, after serving as a training ship, by this time with only one of her main battery turrets aboard the vessel. Decommissioned for the final time in 1933, she spent the next 7 years as a barrack ship, ultimately being slowly broken up between 1950 and 1957. The Brandonburg-Class was an important part of naval history. They were the first ocean-going vessels built for the German fleet in nearly 2 decades. And that's the end of the video. And what a history for this ship. Wow. It was pretty interesting reading and researching for this video. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. Hit that like button and subscribe for more history videos like this one.